Yeah, so this main room, so we essentially do like start that story in 1800, and if you guys know, how much about Chinese history do you guys know?
We know about the opium trade and
Sure, totally, okay.
Culture and how
Yes, exactly. So at that period during the Qing, we've got trade that's opening up thanks to the Opium War loss. So after the Opium Wars, all of a sudden England, France, especially those two, but kind of everywhere starts to trade from China, specifically through Canton. And we see this kind of massive opening up of China and this sending of luxury goods to the West, to Europe, and farther eventually as well. And then we start to see, because this is what happens with trade, the trade of people, right? Yeah. Slave trade is rampant at this time. We are seeing coolies going all over the place, but mostly to South America. And what happens in the United States is that the Chinese are sent over not really as coolies, because they were voluntary in the sense that like they went over knowing that what they were going to be doing and thinking that they would be coming back. So they went over specifically to like get money for their families and bring it back. So not exactly like the slave labor of coolies, it's kind of a misconception there. So yeah, we're just gonna go through super fast. So they come over to the West Coast primarily to bring, build that railroad. This exhibit is supposed to have a little video, but so they're building the railroad, but the big thing about the railroad building is that we don't really see them in the history books about the railroad. This is one of my favorite pictures in the exhibit. If you look, like, I've looked closely a number of times, and you can't identify a single Chinese person, even though it's believed that like up to 80% of the actual builders of the American and Canadian railways were Chinese men, but they were not celebrated, they were not part of the story. This was just one of the openings when they connected the railroad. I don't know exactly where, but yeah, and they're not part of that story at all, so they're not present in it. So as America starts to expand, we've got all of these Chinese people coming in, and instead, even though they helped build so much of like what modern industry in America is considered today, they start to also want to stay, and they kind of have nowhere to go. I mean, there's urbanization at this point. Once the railroads are like built, they want to stay to earn more money, and so they go to the cities to make money, and then they're taking jobs in the cities, and then of course it's exactly like the narrative that we see today, right? Immigrants are coming in and taking all of our white people jobs, which is like absolutely insane, because a lot of those jobs that they were doing were like really, really low wage jobs, jobs that nobody wanted, jobs that they were inventing in the first place. They were taking jobs from nobody, but that's kind of the narrative that started. And so then we get this like whole thing about Chinese coming in and taking things. They're being called rats. You can see literally like in this graphic, he looks like a rat with his Manchu rope hair looking like a tail of a rat, and thinking that like they're stealing everything and they're monopolizing the land and the cities, but then at the same time they're working, yeah, like I said, in these industries that nobody else wants to work, like the fishing, and so the nickname chink actually came from this preparation of fish, which was called iron chink. That's how it's a machine that they used in the fish industry, and there were so many Chinese in that they just started calling Chinese people chinks, which is of course hugely derogatory still today, and it's still a nickname that we hear today. And so because of all of this ends up sort of leading to the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the first and the largest still in history exclusion act of any immigration group in any country ever. And the big things about it is that it kept Chinese, so it trapped the Chinese that were already in the United States, so they couldn't go home. It excluded from anybody from coming over, including women and children. So even if those men that were here, because they were mostly men, had wives and children back in China, they weren't allowed to bring them over. So because of that, it's really a genocide. Like,
Yeah,
that's what we're
really,
calling it, right? If you exclude women and children, it means that you don't want that population to grow and you're trying to kill them off. That's essentially what it is. And it lasted for nearly 100 years. So it was in the mid 1800s, and then we actually don't see it completely abolished until 1960. So it lasted a really, really long time.
So they would like go to these towns and kind of like have riots and stuff, and like.
So something that, well, a lot of this is kind of like propaganda images, portraying the Chinese people as violent, but also within that, similar things to what we saw like in the civil rights period, or even just in the Civil War itself, is lynching and violence from the white communities against the Chinese. So we see, a lot of similar things. The lynching in the streets being very rampant actually for Chinese communities. But they were also specifically depicted as like violent and barbaric because they were mostly men. So they were made up to be like this bachelor society, and you know, they're working but they don't have families and they don't date women and they're just crazy, and it's like, it's kind of like a bro culture, but then it was the policy that made that happen,
Not
right?
their fault.
Yeah, so
No,
it was never their fault, but it was
yes.
like by the public viewed that way. And exclusion was really terrible for anybody who was trying to immigrate into the United States, obviously, because it essentially, you hear all of these stories like about Ellis Island and how tricky it was even for people from Europe to come through and register themselves. There was a similar type of place called Angel Island out on the West Coast, and that was where Chinese people had to go through, but it wasn't just like a passport check. It was essentially a torture station. So they brought them in and they would interview them extensively, and many of them were little boys. So we see a lot of like little boys being examined, both medically and for many other reasons. And that was just all part of this Exclusion Act, because it wanted to separate their families, and it wanted to make sure that nobody was trying to smuggle in their sons and things like that. So, hard to talk about. This room is a very difficult one. And this is like set up so if you like sit in the chair, it's supposed to like simulate the questions that you would hear.
So if you sit here,
if you sit in the chair, and like that's the one little light. And there's a voiceover of what it would feel like to be questioned on Angel Island.
So they would interrogate every person that tried to come in?
They would,
Find the records and they can carry around cards.
So they're trying to figure out like if they have family in the United States already, or are you like trying to get back to your father who might be here. A lot of the bachelor society, these men who were kind of stuck here, were sending money to their families back in China, and they were trying to end that as well. So they would investigate everybody. Yeah.
Interesting.
This is like the culture.
So this is what we call like imagined an intimate room, but it's really based off of the Chinese laundry. So part of the problem with these immigrant communities is that they are harassed and discriminated against, and these stories are spread about them taking jobs. So then there are no jobs left for them, so they have to create a market for them. And laundry was something that nobody was doing. It's a really, really hard labor. Literally, like if you pick up this, we call it the 8-pound livelihood, because this actually weighs 8 pounds, and they would be taking this all day ironing clothes. You're welcome to pick it up. And and this wasn't, another misconception is that people think that people were coming in from China and that this was like their business, right? Just like we see Chinatown restaurants today and everybody's like, well, that's because they had restaurants in China. No, most of these people are coming in having never cooked food before and learning to do it. Just like these people were learning to do laundry, and they're men too, right? Like it wasn't normal for men in China to do their own laundry, and they never used machines like this. They all did hand washing, and they had to learn this and make these laundromats because nobody else would do it. And we see this is one of my favorite images as well in the museum. So it's kind of this transition in the gallery to like how Chinese people are portrayed in media in the United States. So this image is a photograph that was tampered with this one being the original, and then this being the edited version. And the photographer is actually this man, the white man. So he like set up a camera and had it timed, right? And he tampered with it, and then he called it an unassuming victim. And what he's trying to display is, of course, that he is the victim, right? And that like this terrifying looking Chinese man staring at him is violent and barbaric. And this little kid, who no Chinese kid would have been like walking around near Chinatown with like ancient traditional clothing, right? And so this was clearly staged with this child here like by himself, and he got rid of the sort of normally dressed onlookers and made it darker, and just this was sort of the beginning of like the real exoticization. And it's also a good reminder that like even the most historical images like photographs can be tampered with, just like they are today in regular media. Like this is, you know, way before Photoshop, but same kind of thing, right?
That's crazy.
Yeah.
It's, wow.
Yeah, we didn't really understand how something that.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, that photo gets to me every time. And it's a good sort of transition into this room because this is all about the media. So there's like examples of yellowface that are exactly, you know, like blackface. A lot of people don't really talk about yellowface. I think similar to like the model minority myth that we talk about today, the history of the Chinese immigrant group is like so similar to every other immigrant group in the country, but we don't really hear about like how hard it was, right? Because you guys have it so easy, like you're the model minority, right? But that's bad because and it's inaccurate because the Chinese Exclusion Act was literally the first exclusion of immigrants ever, right? And the media portrayed Chinese men as villains, like this Fu Manchu. Where do they think they got Manchu from? The Manchurians, right? The Manchurians, enemies of China even. So super exoticized, and then women who were like submissive and beautiful and objects of desire. So we see both of those tropes a lot in Chinese media in addition to the yellow face. And obviously that's still going on today, and we're still talking about appropriation and white people playing Asian characters in films. That still happens today, right?
Very much.
You know, Crazy Rich Asians can only do so much.
I know.
But hopefully it'll change the world. And then this other side is all about what I mentioned before, that restaurant culture that we sort of start to see grow in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And again, like, it's not because they knew how to cook food. They learned it and nobody else was doing it. And even then, when people started opening restaurants in Chinatown, it was such a foreign food that like nobody wanted to eat it. So they essentially created things like chop suey, which didn't exist in China, and these menus that we still see today of like Chinese American food, which is not like the food from any region of China. Sometimes it's a mixture, sometimes it's like literally not like it at all, right? But that's what they had to do to assimilate and to accommodate to American cultures. So rather than introduce like a new form of food to them, really what they were doing was trying to make their food as American as possible so that Americans would eat it.
Trying to assimilate.
Exactly. So it's actually an assimilation method rather than like any form of education. And something that the Museum of Chinese in America does is that we collect the old menus of restaurants that closed down in Chinatown. So we have a lot of those menus in our collection, and I always like to point out too that we get a lot of people in here who, you know, are white and are not super familiar with Chinese food. And one of the things they always say is like, oh, it's not authentic. And I really like to point out that like, it is authentic.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
Chinese American food is different, but it is still an authentic version of a food and of a culture. So obviously you guys might know that, but
Definitely.
but yeah, like I really like to emphasize that because I hate that word authenticity. I just feel like minimizes the entire Chinese American and Chinatown culture so much, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Oh my gosh.
This is one of my favorite
Yeah, this
parts.
is like-
Favorite part.
I feel like this is such a hodgepodge room because it's like about the opera and we've got the lion dance and we've got like the Bambi stuff, but it's really about where this is like the time period where we see Chinese people, even with the Exclusion Act, have found a way to make money, like with laundry, like with the restaurants, and now they're developing their own sense of community here, finally, right?
Yeah.
So they're forming organizations, they're celebrating their holidays, they're bringing in their art from Chinese New Year, they're starting lion dancing troupes, they're bringing in the opera, and so we have opera costumes here, and they have all of these associations that they're starting and different clubs and stuff like that. So we see a lot of those coming up, and a lot of these associations, like the, which one was I forget which one it is. A couple of them still exist today, but like under different names and things like that. So they're still big parts of the Chinese community in the United States. This is my favorite part of the museum. This is our general store, and again, it's like very much a community-based store, so this is a place where Chinese people could come to get things and goods that they recognize. Just like any sort of general store in Chinatown today, you could get literally everything from like slippers to traditional medicines to picking up your mail. And because of that, it's a lot like what we would consider like a modern day coffee shop, because you come and socialize here. Like, this is where people talked and created connections with each other, and this was very much, and they would play games, and this is where they got their news, and they would have radios from China, and they'd be able to just really connect. So yeah, I love this store. We're hoping to like open this up and turn it into a real cafe in a couple of years.
I would
right? Wouldn't that be cool?
We should come back, guys.
Yeah, awesome.
Okay, cool.
And that's the Bambi I mentioned. So Tyrus Wong was the illustrator for the movie Bambi, and he obviously was also an artist who did his own work. But you can see the similarities to Bambi. And well, you didn't know because he's not even in the credits. So his name is listed absolutely nowhere in the film, and it wasn't until recently that Disney actually said that it was Tyrus Wong, this Asian American, who was responsible for the illustrations. And then a year after that, he died. It was a bit late, late that they got to it, but almost there, yeah. So yeah, this is sort of where we get into the World Wars, especially World War II, but beginning in World War I as well, actually. There was a lot of Chinese American input, right, because they needed people to fight. And it didn't end with the immigrants, even though they were excluded. They were not excluded from wartime, of course. So they did, Chinese soldiers were a huge part of the war efforts, especially in World War II and going into the Cold War era, because of course Japan became an enemy of the United States. And really, this is sort of like before communism and before China took on communism. And so because Japan suddenly becomes this enemy of the country, of the nation, of America, then they want you to be able to distinguish between like a Chinese person and a Japanese person, because the Chinese, this man is your friend, right? But how can you tell Japs from the Chinese? Angry citizens, victimized allies. The Chinese people are a friend. We've always treated them great. We love them. They're part of our society. It's the Japanese that we're fighting and bombing, right?
What?
Except that you've excluded them for 100 years.
Oh my god.
Yeah, so this is sort of when we also start seeing more women as well. Women are finally starting to be allowed into the United States. After the war, obviously, many soldiers from America brought home Asian wives, Asian babies, of all sorts. So women and children start to become part of the sort of national image of Asian Americans in general, including the Chinese ones. And they were a big part of that war effort too, both from home and actually in soldiers. This was about a woman. I think she was one of the first, or the first Asian American fighter pilot, and she was a female, which is pretty awesome.
Saw that.
And so here we have like the Exclusion Act is ending, and we're heading into like the 60s, 70s now. And this is really, of course, when the United States starts to become a lot more liberal, especially with the Korean and Vietnam Wars. You know, even the white people are starting to question like what we're doing in Asia, but also what we're doing on the home front. Why are we going to war? Like, what is this fight about? And we start to see hippie movements and a lot of progressive movements, the feminist movements takes a huge steps forward. LGBTQ movements take huge steps forward.
Yeah, I didn't know there was not, you know, usually I feel like Asian parents, they still have that thing where if you feel like their kids being gay or being, you know,
yes,
it's just very weird to see that. That's
yeah.
the first thing that stood out when I walked into this room was the gay insurgent.
Yeah, so there were, and I feel like nobody thinks about that. Like you just said, yeah, I think there's huge stereotypes for the Asian American community, and that Asians in general are not involved in the LGBTQ movement, but they were there from the very beginning. And yeah, and we don't hear much about that. And that's, you're right, like that's still definitely underrepresented in media and everywhere, like Asian American queer voices or Asian queers in general, right? Yeah, we really don't hear about that. But yeah, definitely involved from the beginning, involved in the anti-Vietnam War, everything, involved in the feminist movements. There were Asian Americans everywhere. So now we see, like, this is just really the end of our gallery, and you'll see obviously the color change is very noticeable because this wall was put up in, I believe, 2010. Yeah, and then we'll be putting up a new wall in 2020, so we're kind of trying to constantly add to the story, right? Maybe you guys will be on that wall somehow. But a lot of what this wall is talking about is the model minority, and really about like issues that we've seen as Asians become so immersed and established as a community in the United States and really accepted, and obviously like here in Monterey Park, California, it's like majority Asians, right? Asians rule California. But with that and with this sort of mass acceptance comes the model minority, which is problematic because it makes a lot of, first of all, it pits immigrant groups against each other, right? If you're the model minority, then what are African Americans or any other immigrant group? And similarly, it's really big problem because Chinese Americans specifically actually have the largest income gap of any group in the United States, right? And you can see it here in Chinatown. There are very, very poor people here, and even though, you know, there's many doctors within the Asian American community, there are also many Asian Americans who are living in poverty, and the model minority makes other people and people of power in the United States think that this community doesn't need assistance and doesn't need help, and that they were fine and that they're always been fine.
Definitely being seen now with like colleges like Harvard not even accepting Asian Americans, you know, they have a limit for us now.
Yes, exactly. Having too, and yeah, then we have problems because there are too many, and they're too smart, and they have to be smarter than white Americans, for example, or any other minority, and yeah, so it's hugely problematic, and I'm working on I'm hoping, so my thesis is on female adoptees from China, so I'm working to get a board about that, because that's another huge immigrant community in the Chinese American group. And the 9/11 one is really interesting. I think we never hear about the Asian Americans that helped in 9/11, but they were a huge part of the firefighting team. So yeah, and Chinatown was obviously involved.
So it's our main gallery. Out of all the people, like weird strange, do you like? What would you point out?
And of course, you can't forget the Bruce Lee one.
Sure. Okay, I definitely like the modern ones just because obviously these are like the names that I grew up with. Maya Lin is the architect of the Vietnam Memorial as well as this museum. So she's one that I love. I love Ong Lee, the filmmaker. I think he's done incredible things. Yo-Yo Ma is a favorite of mine. Maxine Hong Kingston we recently honored, and she's this really incredible feminist writer in the Asian American community. The other thing that I would note about all of these is that you'll notice that one on each wall is a slightly different color. Here it's this one. And amidst all of these, you know, famous Asian Americans from different time periods of history, we also really wanted to highlight a stereotype. So every one of these walls has a stereotype that was introduced in that time period to kind of juxtapose the famous Asian Americans that did really well, right? Because like the model minority, we want to say like, this is a stereotype, and like these people are great representations, but they also like add to sometimes overly positive or negative images of Asian Americans. And yeah, so you'll find like, I think in the first room there's one about just like the Chinaman and where that name came from, and how like nobody ever even asked what a Chinese person's name was when they first arrived. They just like called them Chinamen. And that was that. So I really like the stereotype images.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
this is
of course.
Once we tried to absorb stuff.